Guyana with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful
Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the Emirate of Dubai.
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
With wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful Guyana.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Globespan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh, with Devin Bissoon as the technical operator. Tonight, our topic is morality in politics. We'll come to a definition of morality in a few minutes. Before we do that, let me introduce our panelists, our guests. As usual, joining us, but was not here last week, is Mr. Vincent Alexander, a commissioner at GCOM, the Guyana Elections Commission, Professor Nehusi, who is well known as a political activist and a professor as well of political science, Mr. Ravindra Dev, former member of parliament and a lawyer, and we have Professor Betaram Ramarak. Gentlemen, before we get into our topic, I would like Mr. Vincent Alexander, there was a misunderstanding about a matter pertaining to the history department at the University of Guyana. So I was just wondering whether Mr. Vincent Alexander would like to clarify his statement from about a month ago.
Yes, thank you very much, Vishnu. On the last occasion when I appeared, I indicated that there was no history department at the university. In fact, that information is dated. When I left the university at that time, we did not have a history department. The department was then reduced to, I think, social studies and tourism. But subsequently, they have reintroduced the history department, so that I need to let viewers know that at this point in time, in fact, there is a history department, and the information which I provided on the last occasion is dated information. There was a time when there was no such department, but they have since reintroduced and do have a history department.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification. Gentlemen, if we may just delve right into our topic, morality in politics. So first, let's have the good Professor Nehusi define morality and morality in politics, and then we'll have others chimed in.
Well, thanks, Vishnu, for the invitation to make this definition. I guess we could go into all kinds of high-flown language and plenty dictionary and that kind of thing. But I believe that we should all agree, and this is especially because we're speaking to members of our public, that morality is really good behavior. And it's good behavior in the sense of good public behavior. Of course, we'll be concerned with what people do in their private lives. But when we talk about morality, we usually mean social standards, standards that the whole of society or most of society agree to, because people believe that these standards are the best for the entire society. So I would say morality is good behavior. The second aspect of this is morality in politics. And here I think by politics we mean party politics. And morality in party politics means the same thing. People who are in political parties must behave in ways that are decent, meaning ways that are acceptable for the great number of people in our society. Now that's important because with the kind of party politics we have in Guyana for too long, being so divisive, it's easy for somebody to misbehave, do make a whole number of decisions that have a negative effect on one aspect, one section of the population. And because we tend to be so divisive, we think in terms of our race group usually, and what's good for us is good for us. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing if it's bad for another group of people. I think this is an opportunity for us to start talking about that kind of thing and see that good behavior in politics doesn't necessarily mean what's good for me or what's bad for those people over there. And I think that's a good place to start. If you allow me to, I would urge us to do two other things. One is to recognize that usually when we speak of these things, we fail to use the intellectual resource or resources offered by the tradition of peoples who make up Guyana. You know, African people invented writing and society and had morality, some of which expresses itself in Christianity. Well, do we think about that, about Africa as a source of morality when we talk about, teach about morality? It's the same with India. How about China? And at this moment in the evolution of the world, I think it's important that we recognize that we rob ourselves of a lot of riches when we talk about morality or whatsoever, and we do not include those sources of ourselves as sources of morality. I'll stop here for a moment.
And you didn't mention financial probity. I wonder if it also doesn't include that. And then
yeah, that's part of morality.
And then you were also only focusing about party. It should really be inter-party, not just intra-party alone, but inter-party, nationally, intergovernmental, countrywide, nationwide.
That's implicit, I hope, in what I said.
Very good. Let's get Ravi. Ravi, you want to chime in as a lawyer, morality?
Well, being trained in American law, there is actually a book written by a very big American jurist that states very overtly that there is no morality in law, that law and morality don't actually miss. And in fact, I went to law school as an older student, went at night with other professionals, in the class. And in my naivete, I asked the professor teaching law he asked the question, what is justice? And I, answered, put up my hand as we do in the British system, and talked about justice, morality, which implies morality, justice at the base of justice. And the guy looks at me, and as we say in Guyana, he hopes me. And he says that the purpose of law is not morality. The purpose of law is to get your client off. And, so that's one school of thought. But to come back to, I think, what we're trying to grapple with in Guyana, I think the UC makes a very cogent point there in terms of, let's talk about behavior. Because ethics, some people confuse morality with ethics. Ethics are the rules that govern morality. And I come from a school which puts morality before ethics, meaning the good comes before the right. What is good is prior to what is right. And to get this professorial language in place is called a deontological approach. But as Professor Niwusi has cautioned, we're not going to go down that road. But the simple thing is it has to do with behavior. And I couldn't endorse more, as we did the last time, that in Guyana, we have jettisoned these aspects that we had developed in our homelands. We in Guyana, this is this famous 6 people, we have jettisoned them and adopted a morality that comes out of Europe and the European conquest, which was geared to their experience, which in their encounter with us cannot ever be disjunctured from what they were trying to achieve, which is that they had a Procrustean bed, and I use the Greek term because they would like to hark back to that, to force morality into a mold to justify their actions. So therefore, for example, they enslaved us, they made us as indentured servants for our own good. It was a moral act because, you see, we were bereft of any notions of morality. We were savages, you know, and so on and so forth. So therefore, so we have to be very cautious. But as we agreed in the last encounter, the two of us agreed that therefore we had, and we still have a frame of reference which we should have used, but at a minimum should we begin to use in terms of at least coming to grasp with this whole notion of morality. And that is, what was the cultural, what was the moral stance of our people? For example, as a person from India, from a Hindu perspective, and Hindu is not used in the term of religion, it is simply a way of life called dharma. And that in itself, to give an example, to pick up Kimani's point, just simply tells you what is a dharmic life. What is it? And simply, whatever action, not thought, not belief, whatever action supports society, whatever action upholds society, whatever makes the society live more harmoniously, that is dharma, and that is to be followed. So it's a very simple test that everybody can understand. You can simply ask, so we look at anyone's behavior that we may have some problem with, you know, let's say as a father, my daughter comes home in this very scanty outfit. And so what do I tell her? And that is the simple test that I use. What will the society, what does it do to societal values and all of that? So I just want to, without going further, to pick up on that point, that we have reached a point in Guyana's history where we have to have what I call decoloniality, which is to free our minds of the systemic insertions made by the colonial powers and those aspects that they have pushed into our minds. And I use the word pushed. We should now jettison, and one place to start looking at what to replace it with is in our traditional cultures, which include notions of moral practice. I'll stop there for now.
Vincent Alexander?
Yes, this is a very, very interesting subject area. My most profound thought came to me through a Rasta friend of mine, who Ravi knows pretty well, who said to me he doesn't deal with good and bad, he deals with truth and fact. And he said that because good and bad are highly relative, and so that when one speaks about morality, which is associated with what is good or what is bad, it is highly, highly relative. One may find a homogeneity in the definition by saying, well, it's a question of what's good or what's bad. But what's good and what's bad, there's no uniformity, there's no oneness about that. And therefore, for me, it is important when one talks about morality to juxtapose morality to law, for this reason. When one talks about law, one is talking about prescriptions that are intended to apply across the entire society. It's sometimes virtually an imposition of the behavioral norms across the society. But morality, on the other hand, because of its definitional base, what it actually is in behavioral terms, they differ from group to group. It is not necessarily homogeneous, and you may find the different moral standards and different moral codes and different behavioral patterns across different groups based on their own perception of what is good, what is bad, or what is right, and what is wrong. So when one starts to speak of morality, one really is on very, very slippery turf in terms of, in my view, in a society, in a practical and behavioral manner of defining morality, because there is no one standard that is applicable in terms of what are the moral norms, what is considered good and what is considered bad. And therefore, as we talk about morality in the context of the politics in Guyana, you may well find that there are possibilities of differentiating from a behavioral perspective what is considered to be moral and what is considered to be moral, what is considered to be morality, because morality is often associated not necessarily with the entire nation as a homogeneous whole, which law seeks in some regard to, but it's associated with subgroups, and it's influenced by the interests of those subgroups, sometimes influenced by the belief system, it's influenced by the thought processes of those subgroups as they see things to be right and they see things to be wrong. And in that regard, it links back to what Bobby said about the need for us to look at morality from the standpoint of what was imposed upon us by those who were looking after their interests and seeking at that time to define what was right and what was wrong. So morality, it's a very slippery term. And one has to look across the landscape to the various groups, the various subgroups of the society, and what they have accepted as their correct behavioral norms, not only in theory but in practice. And therefore, one may see a circumstance where one group considers something to be moral, another group considers it to be immoral. So the morality does not find commonality across the various subcultures, the various interests, the various groups in the society.
Well, politicians
That applies
then,
equally to political parties.
politicians then and politicians now have their own definition and their own sense of morality. Not too long ago, I think it was about 20 years or so, Basdeo Pandey said, politics has a morality of its own, meaning that you, no matter what, you have to support your colleagues on your side, whether you feel they're right or wrong. They're always right anyway. Professor Bituram Ramarat, what's your scope on morality in politics? You have to on.
Dr. Batram, you're on mute.
I'm sorry about that. Having to go last, I would say that I agree with everything that has been said here, but I'm always left with the burden to try to move this from an intellectual level to make it operational so people can understand what the heck we're talking about. So I'm going to try to do that, but there's a couple of things I do want to say first. I think whatever standards we apply, I think it's a difficult, task to identify moral behavior and expect people to behave in a certain way. That's a very, it's a slippery slope, and it's a difficult thing to establish. So if you were to apply, let's say, standards of behavior, and again, in the Guyana context, based on what Vincent is saying, and he's absolutely correct, my objective observation could be someone else's subjective assessment. So we have that issue to deal with. But the point is, it is a difficult task to have leaders in a country behave in a way that we could say, well, they're adhering to moral behavior or ethical standards. And I think this has been, from time immemorial. You've got people like Kautilya, who was an advisor to the Chandragupta Empire. You've got, Confucius, who, with his Analects. And of course, you've got, I guess a more recent one would be Machiavelli, who have all emphasized the fact that you have to really focus on what we call, the legalism to kind of regulate and control people's behavior, right? So that being said, it is very difficult, and again, I'm trying to operationalize this in terms of our Guyanese politics. The question then becomes, okay, can we identify people who have behaved in a sense that we can say, well, hey, these are the standards and they have done the right thing and they have behaved, ethically. That's a challenge. I can't think of names in my head. There are a couple of them, I would say, people who have not been tainted, whether we define morality in terms of, sexual behavior, or being corrupt in government and so on. I think the name Chetty Jagan comes to mind as someone who would be sort of ethical or moral in terms of what he has done in terms of a politician. I think Ashton Chase has been a very upright person, whose name is out there, and I don't recall anything that goes to the level of unethical behavior. So my point is, there are very few people, no matter what the standards we establish. If we're talking about, being sexually predatory as an immoral behavior in our context, if you want to believe Marjorie Carr's, she talks about Kofi Badu's behavior towards women. We've got, in more recent times, again, sticking with this sexual kind of predatory behavior, if you're looking at that aspect of morality or immorality, we've got situation in Guyana where, according to the MI files, Janet Jagan, who was in the PVP government, had a tryst with a young man named Shiv Gangadin, who was a member of the UF. And again, to kind of make this a situation that we can kind of hold on to and really understand, it goes both ways, right? And I'm not making accusation, but there are names in the newspapers that keep coming up. You've got names like Kwame McCoy. You've got names like Trotman has come up when it comes to dealing with this kind of untoward behavior. Kelawan Lal name has come up. And I have had occasion to pen a letter about another person, Dr. Barry Ramsaran, in the Dana Ramatar administration, who had threatened to slap someone publicly, an activist by the name of Shalina Nagir. And of course, now we've got the situation with Nigel Dharamlal. So my simple point to this is that if we're going to take this from the intellectual level and try to, to rationalize this, my point is, it is very difficult to establish standards of behavior, right? Secondly, as Vincent has mentioned, over the years, the whole issue of looking at things that would be considered moral or immoral has changed. Right? You look at the United States, for instance, a lot of the stuff that Trump has done and is accused of doing, those are things that you could have gotten into serious trouble, right? If let's say, if you were Bill Clinton in the old days, right? So things have changed. And I think the third point that has to be made when it comes to Guyanese society is the fact that if you look at the recent example with Nigel Dharamlal, is that you're dealing with a society that is fractured in the sense that it is still a male-dominated society. We haven't had examples of, let's say, the Me Too movement and things like that. So women, and especially Amerindian women, are not educated to be able to a point where, you know, they can raise their voice to make sure that, and take actions to make sure that these things don't happen. And I think the last point I do want to make here is that because we are a fractured society, it comes back to what I said before. What could be objective to me could be subjective to someone else, because we are a divided society. And with the current case that we have, we see people politicizing an event. And at the same time, we see people who are acting with the herd mentality and supporting because the government hasn't taken action. So what I'm trying to say here is that because we're so divided, that division is going to make things highly political, right? But we are also faced with a situation that we don't have that national consensus. And it is going to be a difficult thing to do in a divided society like us. We're not unique in that sense, right? There are a lot of third world people, you know, who have been, you know, nuts and crazy when it comes to immoral behavior. But it is going to be a challenge for us in Guyana, and partially because, you know, we are coming from a society where we are not that sophisticated, or we're not at that level where we can say, look, you know, this is a problem, we need to address it. You know, because like I said, we have had these kinds of behavior before, many times before. But, and I'm going to end here, the hope is that with what we are seeing now, this would be an example of a situation where we can kind of move the pendulum away from the plantation politics, you know, towards a more uplifting political culture, so to speak, where we can prevent these things, whether it's of a sexual nature or something else, right? So we can prevent this from happening. But it is going to be a challenge. It's not going to be easy. I'll leave it at that.
So Dr. Kimani Nehumsi, Dr. Ramarak had started to give relevance and concrete examples of make it applicable to Guyana. Why is this relevant to us? Why are we discussing it with regards to Guyana at this particular juncture?
Well, it's relevant to us because it's relevant to any society at any stage in its development, or even we might say evolution. You have to have rules that everybody could navigate by. Part of our challenge in Guyana is that we're mostly a destroyed society. Rafi keeps making the point that we have to decolonize. And we, most of us, Guyanese, don't understand that we are still in the grips of values that were imposed upon us by mass murderers, mass rapists, mass kidnappers, armed robbers on a grand scale. I mean, this is what Europeans, Western Europeans, this is how they behaved. And we've been laden with a misrepresentation of their behaviors that attempts to present them as people who were far from what they were. And I'm talking about the dominant elements among Western Europeans. I'm not saying that every single Western European is like that. There are honorable exceptions. But these were organized armed robbers, mass murderers, and so on. And at the level of what we might call morality ideas, guiding ideas, their behavior is thinking also. Consider this. One of the greatest rapists, bandits, mass murderers in the world was selected for me to be my role model. That's a name that was inflicted upon me. I wouldn't honor it by mentioning it. But I think it's important that we understand that my parents, who wanted the best for me without any shadow of a doubt, were so persuaded by these people, by Western Europeans, that their moral examples were good enough for us, that they decided that the name of this armed bandit, mass murderer, and rapist was a good name for me. And I use name in inverted commas in that sense. Now, these are practical examples, you know, of how we have been misinformed, misled, and inflicted with very, very deadly values that many of us don't even suspect happened. And this is back to Rafi's point. We have been mistreated. The system of how we think is still infected, and I really do mean that word, infected with the nastiness those people imposed upon us. And, you know, when Rafi talked about the ethics, and we need to define, to recognize that ethics is how individuals behave. And your ethics ought to be in consonance with the moral values of a society. But Rafi, when you said that, you know, the ethics of the law, according to one professor in the United States, is to get your client off. There are two things. There's one possible saving grace, and I don't think it should be left at that. But remember that the English system, which is inherited by the United States, is the adversarial system, where you have two opposing lawyers, and you have a presiding judge or magistrate. And the system is supposed to be a search for the truth. You know, the legal system is supposed to be a search for the truth. The continental system in Europe is a different system. People in China and India and Africa had different systems also. And we got to keep coming back to that, because we always use our oppressors' system as our reference point. And I'm saying, no, they're not the only people with systems. And very often, their experience, our experience of them, is so negative that these are not the best examples. You know, so I would say that, yes, the system, the legal system as practiced under the inheritance from the English, has got to be, you got to recognize it as a search for the truth. And it's upon the truth that you could get justice. But even that British system is built upon British custom and practice. That is what you call the law. That's the source of law, or at least one important source of law in the English system. And I think it's important that we see that we get British custom and practice along with the other sources of law, of course, you know, like the parliament and jurisprudence and so on. But these are issues that I think we've got to understand. And Vincent's point about different people or different groups in our society having different, let's say, interpretations of what morality should be, makes it very important, and I think urgent, that we in our society begin to discuss these issues. Because the longer we postpone real discussion, information sharing, understanding, the longer we postpone that moment when somebody will wake up at some stage in Guyana and say, hey, you know something? All of us or most of us agree on what morality is, or these different aspects of morality. That's the only way we can do it. And our discussions, our attempt to arrive at that magic moment has got to be informed by the experiences of all of us. And when I say experiences, I don't only mean what happened under colonial domination. I also mean the thousands of years of experience and refinement that went into the making of the moral and ethical systems of the cultures of Native America, of Africa, of India, of China. And I want to emphasize that we rob ourselves of thousands of years of well-intentioned experience, usually, when we elect to focus upon the degradatory laws and usages that we inherited from people who committed the greatest crimes in human history against us. I'm talking about Western European colonization. I'm talking about enslavement. I'm talking about the ethical behaviors of priests and governors, soldiers and so on, Western Europeans who lorded it over lots of millions of people in oppressed communities. Here's my last point. We heard about Kautilya, Confucius, and so on. So it's important for me to say this, that thousands of years ago, African people, and we have many names, I just want to put forward Tahotep, who had moral system. Ma'at is a system that evolved in Kemet, ancient Egypt. And Ma'at still has relevance in the world today, but most of us don't even know. Most of what is called Christianity, the precepts of Christianity, come from Africa, from Ma'at. Let me give you one example. There's a book called Pret Em Heru, which in ancient Egyptian means the book of obtaining righteousness. Europeans misname it the Egyptian Book of the Dead. If you look at the 42 declarations of innocence, you will see what Moses, whose name was an ancient Egyptian name, Moses, born of, preceding to the 10 Commandments. It appears twice in the Bible. And there are many, many other examples of this kind of thing. It's not appropriate for me to go into details about them here. But I mention that in order to show that we have potentially at our disposal fascinating and very, very relevant resources from all our cultures that we could use to inform discussion, to educate each other, and really come to know ourselves in that way. Final point here is that morality is not only what you do, is what you neglected to do when it should have been done. And I think it's very important to mention this, because one of the criticisms of Dr. Jagan is that after a certain point in time, people of a certain persuasion that we would normally call racist started to have a great influence in his party. Now, was it something that Dr. Jagan was responsible for? Should he have challenged it? These are some of the kinds of discussions we need to have. And it doesn't necessarily mean that Dr. Jagan should be any less a hero to all of us or anything of the sort. No one of us could be perfect, especially in the can of worms we call society that we live in, especially like Guyana. And it's important for us to be able to honestly interrogate our experiences and say, yeah, of course, this is 2023. We have the perfect vision of hindsight. And we could say, well, yes, so-and-so should have done this then or could have done that. We need to be able to conduct these kinds of discussions and put all our experiences under the searchlight. The fact is that if we are really the people we say we are, we deserve the best from the best among us. So the best experiences should be the ones going forward. And that will only be known when we interrogate everything in our streams of consciousness, of morality, and of ethical behaviors that we started building and setting forth for ourselves many thousands of years ago, before the encounters with armed bandits.
Let's hear from Ravi. Ravi?
Well, I think what we can do is to try to, in moving ahead, or trying to move ahead, to synthesize some of what we have heard. Vincent makes a very valid point. In fact, building upon what we had made, is that there is no one morality when you have individuals who come from different experiences, and to use the term popular nowadays, different lived experience. As Kimani emphasizes, those lived experience extends into our hoary past of millennia, and we just can't discard them. So how do we then come to grips to live in the present? And I think what has been done, and this is where we have to jettison the whole European or British notion of total assimilation, that there has to be only one way. That has been their experience. That has been their theology. There can only be one God, and then there can be only one culture, and there can be only one way. I think if we in Guyana accept, as the ancient people of India did, and I'm sure Africa too, without knowing the citation, I can cite from Rig Veda. It says that the Creator said, Eko Ham Bahusiam, that I am one, let there be many. So therefore, diversity is the nature of the universe. From the atoms beyond and beyond into the multiverse that we are now getting a glimpse of, diversity is it. There is no one. There is no e unum pluribus, out of many one. You don't have to be. And in law or in anything, we have to begin to accept what the ancient cultures have taught us through their experience, and that's important. They weren't engaged in any kind of conquest, which says only my way or no way. So we have to start from that. So to come back to Vincent's point that he put up, how do we then go forward? And I think this is the type of discussion that is needed. That in our culture, the culture that I am out of, you sit in a circle. I was very pleased when my party, ROAR, coalesced with GAP, the Amerindian party at that time. And when we met, I found that they also, when in discussing, you sit in a circle. There's no my side and your side. You sit in a circle and you go around that circle until you find consensus. There was no any voting. You had to come. So even if the discussion would last all night, you come to a consensus. So for example, when we got a one seat between GAP and ROAR, we had a consensus that Franklin, right, Everall Franklin would represent ROAR and GAP. There was a consensus about it. We didn't ever vote on that. So I think, Vincent, to come back to what you pose on specific, if we are to create law about it, because at any given time you will have to have law, but know that law will have to be amended as society progresses, right? There was the old Greek saying, which I am versing Greek thought of being drummed into my head, of Zeno saying, you can never put your toe into the same river. Both you and the river have changed. So we know we're going to have change. But let me start like that. That if we are to make a rule, there has to be a rule on a given set of behavior at a given time in our history. And that's where we stand right now. And we have to do that. But again, I want to emphasize that let us bring it to what Beto brought into real life as to sexual behavior of those in officialdom. Now, I come out of the 50s and grew up in the 60s, and I always speak about the mixed village of Iflat, right? And before the program, I was talking to Kimani about the history of the Iflat village, where they moved out, the freed slaves moved out after abolition in 1838. I moved out. And all I can get in the official record, even by our historian David Granger, was that St. Luke's Parish was founded in 1841. I can't find a word about the village of Iflat, those who came out. Because as a boy, and last week when I went back into that portion of the village, You know, why were the houses all together? How were they built? How did they live together? Those questions are unanswered. But one of the answers came out, and we talked about those who were mixed in the village. So there were two kinds of mixed, and both came out of rape. And we tend to hide that. In my section of the village, they were the Mitchells. The Mitchells came out of a white overseer from the 40s and produced 4 children. They were all, you know, fair skin, we call them. We would call them red nowadays, I understand. One of them, of course, our jungle school of warfare is named after him, Robert Mitchell. We call him Barney Bernard Mitchell. He grew up, you know, we grew up in the same street and all that. But his mom was a maid in the home and ended up with 4 children. There was another Indian woman who ended up with 2 children from a Wallace. And you can check these classic Scottish names because most of the overseers were Scottish, the Mitchells. And look at the children's name: Malcolm, Robert, Georgie, who was my groom match, as we say, you know, and the girl, right? The point is, though, that they were all, the rape was not even commented about. Once you had power, you then could rape that maid and force her to have your children because she needed to live, right? She came from Decolonizing, where my foreparents came out of. I knew the older Mrs. Johnson, right, from Decolonizing. So she was Mrs. Johnson's daughter, but she had to live with that, right? Then this last weekend, I found out something which I didn't know. I am returning because I'm talking to all of the older fellows. Some are a bit older than me, and I talked to them about that. Apparently, one of the ministers of this Eiffel Church of Scotland school had a child with one of the parishioners. So even the missionaries who were sent down did their bit of raping. So when we talk of this unequal power relations that had this sexual, you know, outrage being committed by those with power, it just didn't start in the here and now. I'm not excusing, but I'm saying that we have to be cognizant that these mores are very deeply embedded in our society, and it goes back. So we have to look at these authoritarian structures, that the moment we put some people into government, we make them minister, they could be running around in the street next to us. You know, the moment they become a minister, they talk different, their expectations are different, their shoulders, their swagger become different as they enter that same village. I'll never forget my one term in the parliament. To see these same guys who, you know, we used to gaff and talk about, these things became very open in terms of sexual exploitation of women, right? In fact, in very mocking terms, our now opposition, one of our opposition leaders, Kemraj Ramjatan, used to mockingly refer to me as Pandit. Hey, Pandit, how you doing? Meaning, I was supposed to be very uptight about these matters. So I was to be mocked as a Pandit, not fit for politics, you see? So I want to bring this thing to some kind of, where do we go from here? We have to look at all of these and not to simply assume that it's an individual thing. Coming back to the whole coloniality, it is also a systemic problem in our society in terms of how power can be utilized. And one of the ways it was utilized throughout our history, our particular history, was in sexual exploitation of our women. So we have to put a stop to that. The other one would be, of course, is that when we come back to, we can't just discard the notions of what is proper. Because there again, I look at our own, belief in a simple one, in terms of the way one even expresses one's sexuality. Most of the Guyanese Indians come from a part of India called the Bhojpuri belt, where they are in India, even in modern India, they are derided as being, like country bumpkins, so to speak. And one of the things is that their form of dance is very sexually explicit. They don't dance with the shoulders. They dance with their waist, right? So if, as a boy, when we went to wedding houses, you would wind down. You understand? And that was not seen as proper. But who defined that? Because we were dragged across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans during British times. And that type of dance form, similarly to African dance forms, have been derided as somehow being more vulgar, because that was not how the British waltz, they were not, while they were raping women right, left, and center, their dance was more chaste, and ours was not so chaste. And we accepted that. Who tells me that I shouldn't be winding down to chutney music or when we go to Matikor, when the women can do their thing, and we shouldn't be doing that. So I would like to close with this, is that when I went to America in 1972 to do further studies at Brooklyn College and then do law, John Rawls, even within the American system, had come out with his theory of justice. And Rawls confronted pluralism in what is justice. And he gives, at least to them, he had offered some tests as to how you can now do this discussion and debate and discourse and come to some kind of understanding. So he thought for certain beliefs, you had thick or thin versions, meaning some groups would have to accept that, man, we're not going to fight to the death over this particular form of behavior, right? So from a Hindu standpoint, it is not an ultimate determinant of what good for the society. So that would be the acid test. Does it put forward, does it sustain society where we are right now, or do we, or does it uphold it or drag it down? And that will be acid test. I would like to throw out, just in passing, that these questions were debated in 2015 when the new APNU government tried to introduce a code of conduct and tried to put it into the Integrity Act. And I'd like us to throw this out that we had this discussion before when they had 10 points of directives or guides for morality. And I'll come back to that.
That's a long, Vincent?
I would like to pick up from that point that Rafi made about diversity. It's a reality. It's something that no one has the right to attempt to eradicate it. Natural, and it's people's right to be who they are. On the basis of diversity, I would think that you're going to end up with morals, moral codes, moral behaviors that correspond with the segmentation that diversity speaks to. And that segmentation could be both horizontal and vertical. Different social structure, for example, can tell you about the vertical difference. Horizontal can tell you about different interest groups, though they may be of the same social strata. You have to accept that you're going to have this diversity, which will manifest itself also in our morals, in our morals that are not, I emphasize, homogeneous. In that circumstance, one has to see how you can achieve unity in diversity. Unity in diversity. And so I think that one has to work towards establishing some basic morals that are unique to all of the groups. And I think that in many regards, history provides us with that. I think if one looks across the horizontal plane, you will find that in the various religious groups, notwithstanding the fact that they have different differences, that there's some basic moral rules that apply, you know. And, one could relate these in some regards to what natural law has thrown up. What natural law has thrown up, thou shalt not kill, things like that. Let's see them in the first instance as moral rules. But what we see is that in attempting to identify that baseline, so to speak, or the commonalities that allow diversity to coexist, that there's a role that the legal system has to play. If one goes to the theorists, the jurisprudence, they will tell you that law and morality is not the same, but they will also tell you that there's a lot of overlap between law and morality. And I think where the overlap occurs very often is in the realm of natural law in the first instance, as opposed to public policy law. So I think we have a basis on which we can say, hey, here is the ground level in terms of what our moral codes, our moral behaviors, our moral standards should reflect. And so that though morality and law is not the same, I think that law could be used in some regards to enshrine basic morality across the diversity that we're speaking about, accepting that there will be differences as there is in diversity in morality as well, but that there's a fundamental bottom line that should be embraced. But since we're speaking about morality in the context of our political system and our political parties, then the question will arise, where do we find that bottom line? Where do we find that bottom line? I think that in some regards, all politicians tend to have similar articulations on some things, the rule of law and good governance and things like that. Though the behavior may not necessarily conform, and even the articulation may differ. But I think that whether we like it or not, that one of the things globalization has done is to throw up some norms which are universal and which, if observed, could be seen to be a good baseline for morality globally, a good baseline for morality across diversity, and a good baseline for morality across political parties. I think to a very large extent, the elements of good governance seem to have emerged as that commonality which could be embraced, so that in a society where you have a legal system that is universal, applicable to all, and moral systems which are not necessarily applicable to all, that is a core of morality that's applicable to all, that I think has emerged and manifests itself largely in the principles of good governance, be it the principle of accountability, be it the principle of involvement, be it the principle of ethics, be it the principle of anti-corruption, which is also including ethics. A number of those principles which have emerged, which I think are the basis for us to be able to speak about morality from one platform and one perspective, in the face of the acceptance that morality will never be a complete homogeneous system, and that in fact it may be immoral if we attempted to have one homogeneous system of morality imposed. Morality itself is not about imposition, really. It's about social, peer kind of pressure and acceptance. So I think that is the direction in which we've got to move. That direction can come out of an understanding largely of our history as well, because our history does point to commonalities which we have embraced and which we can continue to embrace. Our history points to an evolution of standards and norms which have some universal acclaim, and therefore those can now become the basis for morality that we have across diversity, and the morality that we have across even our political parties. And in that regard, one can see the emergence of codes that seek to speak to that morality, as much as one can see the morality being embedded in law, because it's been accepted from the inception that though law and morality are not necessarily the same, that there is an overlap between law and morality has very often been enforced by law. And if one wants to speak to something that is national, so to speak, then it has to be something that is in some regards based on our legal system, not necessarily originating in the legal system, but being enshrined and protected and universalized by the legal system.
Dr. Ramrock, how can we get politicians to behave, in quotes, morally? Is it possible?
Well, you know, as I said earlier, it's a challenge, right? And a lot of that has to come from the public, outcries, you know, from the public, and we've seen that recently. And of course, I've always said in the situation where Guyana is concerned, sometimes it may also require intervention. You know, people have problems in a marriage, they go to a third party, right? So sometimes you may need to have that third party intervention, whether it's CARICOM or someone else, right? So that being said, and again, to come back to this whole notion of, you know, moving from the theoretical to the practical, if someone is sitting in Kanji or you know, or Georgetown trying to make sense of you know, of this discussion we have here. I do want to come back to something more practical, and maybe you learned gentlemen can help me understand this. It's one thing, you know, that Professor Kimani can talk about, you know, what the Europeans have done and all of the things that comes with colonialism and so on. But the practical reality is that, you know, we are living in a European constructed world. And if you're going to overthrow and remove that system and create a whole new set of norms, it means that you have to have some kind of unity among every country that was part of that European control to remove that system. Vincent says globalization is with us. So my point is, yes, we can take some examples of what, you know, was done in Kemet, or what was done in the Panchayat system in India. We can take those examples, but the reality of it is that we live in a world where, as we have been seeing here today, to get to those, you know, those bottom line experiences that could help us to build consensus, a lot of that has to do with, you know, our own lived experiences, a term that you guys have used. So my problem here with this is that we are not necessarily focusing on trying to address the real problem that we're trying to grapple with. Yes, I'm saying it's difficult, you know, to legalize morality, but we're living in an environment where the norms are changing. And as society becomes more educated, you know, we're going to get closer to that point. My second point is this. My point here is that the breakdown in morality, now I'm going to lay this squarely, but not necessarily only at the feet of the PNC. I think when you start rigging elections, and nobody on this panel is saying that, when you start getting into a situation, whether the PNC was installed by the CIA or whatever, when you have a system of rigged election and people with absolute power doing things, so that breakdown starts there. I'm not saying it doesn't exist now. It does exist in many different ways, and you see people speaking out and talking about that. But the fact that we have a very divided society means that you have the racialization and politicization of the problem on one side, and you do have the herd mentality. And I would be the first to admit to all of you folks here that I am very disappointed in the way that Indians have actually responded to this situation with Dharamlal, because many of them have actually sided with the government and not necessarily even raising the possibility that this could be a problem and there was something wrong here, given the fact that we've had a desecration of parliament that occurred before and a similar situation. So that's my disappointed with Indians in this. But again, I'm seeing it's also been politicized, and that's something that we have to recognize because we live in a society. But I do have a question. Kimani began to talk about something, and I missed that point, about what happened under the PPP regime, I guess, with Chedi Jagan. I'm not sure what he was alluding to, but I'm just curious, what that really means and how that may be connected to this whole notion of, ethical or unethical behavior and morality that we're discussing here tonight.
Gentlemen, we just have about 15 minutes left, so if you could just restrict your comments to about 3-4 minutes only.
Okay, let me respond to Dr. Ramharak immediately. It wasn't an illusion, it was a statement, allusion, sorry. It was a statement of fact. I'm saying that morality is not only what we do, but what we did not do. And I also said that sometimes it's very difficult for somebody who lives in a particular moment to see certain things. And as we conduct our 2020 vision or post-mortem of these things, the 2020 vision, we need to take that into account. But being what we are, people are going to have one-sided views anyhow. But my point is that I didn't put it in this way, but I'm going to put it in this way now. The PPP, after the split with Forbes Burnham, was a different political party. It was, for all intents and purposes, overwhelmingly an Indian political party. And a lot of its politics started to reflect the interests of the Indian section of Guyana. Fact is, the Indian middle class in Guyana. And I put that out there because I want us to begin to recognize that, yes, somebody might be looking after their section of the population, but that's precisely our challenge, So I leave that in the interest of.
But the problem with that perception, if I may, if we're talking about trying to find, as Vincent said, those bottom lines, and we're looking at the lived experiences, many Guyanese are still alive whose lives were touched, right, by Chedi, but not just Chedi, but somehow I get the feeling, and I'm not making any accusation, we somehow tend to apply the same yardstick to the PNC experience. If there were missed opportunities within the PPP, there must have been some missed opportunities within the PNC, which has also governed Guyana for so many years. So I don't see that similar, if you want to call it a moral equivalence, but somehow that seems to be out of the equation.
The fact that you mention it in this way suggests to me that there is a problem. And it's the same problem you're talking about. If we say X about the PPP, we have to find a Y to say about the PN.
I'm not saying, but you will be surprised. Just a quick point. You will be surprised. And again, this, I think, is a mistake that the PPP, especially Chedi Jagan, has done a lot to destroy the Indian voice and Indian organization. And the one source that I could find that really tries to explain, that situation was from a quote from Ashton Chase, who try to give an explanation as to why the PPP has never really, adopted that Indian voice, addressed the imbalance in the army. So my point is, I'm not defending PPP. I would be the last person. Donald Ramatar said I was with the CIA. I'm a rich Indian. I'm anti-PPP. So I'm not. I don't even want to go there. But my simple point is, and again, I don't want to drag this on, is that, if we're going to be, upfront and look for consensus and those common ground, we have to recognize that there's something wrong, right? And that problem has to do with both sides of the equation. And I think if we're going to go around that table, everybody have to grieve, to grieve, and the truth and reconciliation is important, for all of us. That's just the point I'm making. I'm not throwing aspersions. I'm just,
All right. If I might resume, I'll point to my book called The People's Political History of Guyana.
Which I
think anybody who reads that book would know how I feel about colonial politics, including the politics of Barnum and Jagan. So I'm not here to defend a particular political party. I'm here to talk about what I see is wrong with our system. In a discussion like this, which is not on Barnum or Jagan, we can't get in all the points that are relevant to an overall understanding of my position. But I did say that both of them were both proponents, opponents, and victims of colonial politics. And I'm going to leave it at there. The way in which that becomes real for each one of those two individual leaders is different. But
I agree.
There were three things. They were opponents of colonial politics. They were proponents of colonial politics in some ways, and they were victims of it. In responding quickly to what other members of this panel have said, let me just make a point that I think needs to be made because it's not usually made. And this is that men also were victims of rape under colonialism. We hide that kind of thing. Many men were victims of rape under colonialism. And if we're going to be honest and truthful and as well-meaning, well-intentioned as we need to be, we're going to have to admit that. It's a fact. And it's something that men in many so-called post-colonial societies are not dealing with openly. So I'll leave that out there. And I think it's important to follow up on something, two things that Ravi said. One is this is power. This is people in power exerting their power on people who have no or less power than them. Usually, it's a man in power exerting his power on women or a woman. And under the colonial system, and again, I could refer you to my book, where on a particular estate, a white estate manager wanted to get rid of the husband of a woman he had his eyes on. It caused a protest, a riot, as under the colonial terminology. I don't necessarily agree that these were all riots. And one of the interesting things is how the police officer, all the colonial officials concerned, conspired to exonerate this obviously guilty white rapist. And I think that these are things that we need to be very careful to examine, because some of those models of behaviors might well be instructing bad behavior among us today. And we haven't asked that question. Where do these behaviors come from among our people, whether we're Indian and African or Indigenous American or mixed race people, whose tradition doesn't necessarily permit that kind of behavior? Now, I'm not saying it never occurred in Africa, that I know a bit about. But I'm saying that in Africa, the weight of morality, the social ideals, the moral ideals, wasn't that kind of behavior. And in our attempts to understand ourselves, these are the judgments we need to make. These are the familiarities we need to develop with our own history. After all, India, Africa, China, indigenous America had been civilized for thousands of years before Europe. And that's something we need to understand, because what we elect to do too often is to jettison thousands of years of development and follow barbarians who came upon the pages of history recently. And I have no regrets or hesitation in saying that. Here's my last point. It picks up again from something that Ravi said. Sitting in a circle and talking, exchanging views, debating, whatever you want to call it, until you reach consensus is exactly African. That's how African people did it. And in Guyana, in our language, we have words that tell us about that experience, but we don't know. So when we talk about Ganda, open Ganda, a Ganda is a circle in Kikongo language where people did exactly that. The word for a very learned person is Nganda, again in Kikongo. Then we talk about Kina. It's the same language. And all these terms address very, very advanced systems of knowledge. In European terminology, we talk about secret society and we dumb it down. That's the African version, later African version of what Europeans got from Kemet, ancient Egypt, that they call the lodge. And some of us inherit that lodge from Europeans. So when we encounter our own writing, ancient Egyptian, so-called hieroglyphs, we don't even know it comes from us. So these are issues that we will have to begin to address, reclaim our systems of knowledge, morality, whatever you want to call it. And then we could make the kind of judgment that Betaram, I think, is asking us to make implicitly. The kind of nastiness isn't always our models. They were imposed upon us by other people, and we inculcated them because we don't know anything better. And we don't know anything better, usually, because we don't know our own history on these issues.
Rafi, we just got a few minutes left. You want to
I know. Yeah, let me just plunge right in that. Basically, in invoking the PNC and the PPP and its formation, I think that brings up the question of morality and politics at a macro level, because you have the morality of the individuals who then occupy places in the organization of politics, but you have another morality that the institution of politics and political parties have adopted. And we got to look at the implications of that morality. So, for example, you had Dr. Jagan with his Marxist morality that he adopted from Lenin's little books, as he confessed. And he, don't smirk there, Vincent, that he adopted, and he felt that was the end all, and he felt that's how he judged all activities. Forbes Burnham, we know, from a very youthful age, adopted the political philosophy of Machiavelli. And while Machiavelli has, a bad name nowadays, he's a political realist, and in fact is very much in vogue in the present dispensation. So the implications of those morality played out, and we can then talk about whether it was good or bad for Guyana. But we can't ignore that, and at some point maybe we'll discuss that morality, because in the present age, we are now playing according to the rules of neoliberalism, the morality of neoliberalism, which says very clearly that the market makes moral judgments as to who will live and who will die. It's a decision to be made by the marketplace. There's no human intervention. The market will make all decisions, and explicitly, as Anne Rand said, will make moral decisions. So we have to understand what we are governed by today. And this is something that I have tried to talk a lot about, and some of our interlocutors refuse to accept that mold that we are now being herded by under the morality of neoliberalism, to say, let's not talk about poverty, let's not talk about certain things, let us simply talk about what is useful for the market. I will close, as I promised, with one little thing that we went through this in 2015 when Trotman, a year after he had been accused of some sexual impropriety with a young boy, he introduced, as he had been mandated to do, a set of a code that would have been inserted into our integrity legislation that was to guide us. These were the so-called Nolan principles out of the Western system, but they had 10 principles. I wouldn't go into all of them. One of them was accountability. And within that subset of accountability, you had Article 8 on sexual misconduct, which I think is apropos where we have found ourselves here. And this is on the books. It was an act debated in Parliament and is there, yet I've seen no one refer to it. Sexual misconduct, Article 8. No person in public life shall pursue a course of conduct which amounts to offensive sexual comments, gestures, or physical contact, or such conduct of a criminal nature under the Sexual Offences Act. And secondly, no person in public life shall, in the course of the performance of his or her official duties, pursue a course of conduct by which he or she exploits his or her position or authority for sexual gratification. So that is an example of a principle which was discussed. There were submissions that were requested, submissions were made to the committee, it went to Parliament, it was debated, and this was signed into the Integrity Act, and I expect it's still there, somewhere there, very buried. I leave you with that.
Vincent?
As we discuss the question of morality, we have to recognize that basically morality is a part of the societal superstructural system, and to a very large extent represents the various interests and the various attempts at occupying space at the base of the society, the economic relations to a very, very large extent. I think we ought to recognize that. And therefore, if we recognize that, we recognize that basically the origin of the diversity and the diversity which has thrown up ugly elements has a lot to do with, on one hand, economic relations, and on the other hand, power relations, political relations, which are the ones that are most impacting in terms of fashioning and concretizing and protecting economic relations. I think that is where the origin, the dynamics finds itself in economic relations. From day one, the Europeans come in to exploit the Amerindians and imposing certain rules of engagement, coming right through to modern day in terms of the interaction between various people as they occupy various spaces on the economic landscape. Bearing in mind that the political power and power at large is what is used to impose and retain those systems, and they have a spin-off in terms of issues of status and things like that in terms of power relations. So we have to understand where the grounding is. Grounding is in the dispositions of the peoples in terms of their economic relations, bearing in mind their own heritage and tradition that they bring into that, and the situational attempts to find space and place in systems that are people are pitted against each other. And what we're really talking about now is how we can get to some point of harmonization and equalization, even in the retention of diversity.
Let's give Professor Ramarak the last word.
Well, I'd like to leave, your audience with something very specific. If I can end with this, and I think Kimani and Vincent and Ravi and myself can all agree on this. One of the things we have to do, and I think it's always like on a yearly basis, we have to take a mandated course on what is termed sexual abuse and things dealing with what is a sexual predator, especially in institutions where you're dealing with this power relationship, between people who have power and students. And I think that would be something we can start with in Guyana. I don't know how many people have read the provisions that Ravi just outlined, but this would be something practical that maybe every government official, every teacher, everyone who work in a private or public institution can probably benefit from this. And certainly we have here, and like I said, it is mandatory in many private and public institutions here. So I will leave your audience with that.
I am afraid that will be the last word. We have run out of time. Thank you, gentlemen, for spending your evening with us. Ladies and gentlemen, viewers, listeners, thank you for joining us tonight. Globespan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh, with technical operator Mr. Devin Bissoon. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we look forward for you again in a couple of weeks. Good night.
Gentlemen.